Leviticus chapter 4. We've been through 3 chapters now, which means we have only 24 chapters to go. We started several weeks ago in a sort of methodical series through the book of Leviticus. We've already looked at 2 of the 5 offerings. I told you there are 5 offerings in the book of Leviticus. We've looked at really 3 of them, 2 of them in this series and 1 of them earlier. So today we're going to move into the 4th and 5th of the 5 sacrifices, and then we'll be done with the sacrifices and we can move forward because there's a lot more of Leviticus than just how to kill things. Okay, so, and praise God. So we're gonna get into that starting next week. Today we're gonna finish up with the sacrifices. And we'll begin in chapter 4, verse 1. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. This is how you are to deal with those who sin unintentionally by doing anything that violates one of the Lord's commands.'" So far, each of the sacrifices that we've looked at have had a specific purpose, a function that they served, something that they accomplish when you perform the sacrifice. So the burnt offering is there to atone for sin. When you've done something just high-handed to God, you can actually come back and offer this sacrifice and be made right with God. And then the peace offering was a way of celebrating the peace that you have because of the burnt offering. The sin offering is there as a provision for sins that are committed unintentionally. So that's the reason for the sin offering. It's for unintentional sin, which so already right away I'm a little skeptical because how do you sin unintentionally? That doesn't make any sense. Don't you have to know what you're doing in order for it to be sin? Can you even sin if you weren't trying to break one of God's laws? Don't you have to be aware of what the law is and aware of what you're doing? And so how can you sin unintentionally? And then even if you can, I have to wonder how often this would have happened. How often does someone come to the tabernacle and say, yesterday I was walking down the road and there was this wagon going by that had a bunch of idols on it, and I tripped over a rock and fell down, and I didn't mean to, but I accidentally bowed down in front of an idol, and so now I need to come because I unintentionally sinned. Or I accidentally robbed a bank. Or on accident, I broke the Sabbath because, I drove home on the Sabbath and I got there before sundown, but then I forgot about daylight savings time, and so the Sabbath actually started an hour earlier than I was expecting, and so, sorry, I unintentionally broke the Sabbath. I mean, how often does something like this actually happen? So right away, I'm kind of skeptical. But let's go ahead and look at how this would have been offered. Verse 3. "If the high priest sins, bringing guilt upon the entire community, he must give a sin offering for the sin he has committed. He must present to the Lord a young bull with no defects." This first sort of run-through of this sacrifice is only for the high priest. It's only if the high priest sins unintentionally. This is something new. We haven't encountered this in any of the other sacrifices. In the other sacrifices, we had the sort of graded system of bring a bull. If you can't afford a bull, bring a goat or a sheep. And if you can't afford a sheep, bring a bird. So we've seen this sort of tapered system before. But it was always based on wealth. And now we start with if you're the high priest and you sin unintentionally, then you've brought guilt on the whole community, which that's kind of weird. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. But the first thing the high priest has to do in verse 4, well, he presents the animal, and then verse 4, he must bring the bull to the Lord at the entrance of the tabernacle, lay his hand on the bull's head, and slaughter it before the Lord. The high priest will then take some of the bull's blood into the tabernacle. This, again, is a little bit different. Because with the first 2 sacrifices that we've looked at, when you deal with blood, and I know you see the bull and you're like, oh, here it comes. The first 2 sacrifices that we looked at, the burnt offering and the peace offering, you take the blood of the animal that's been slaughtered and you splatter it or slosh it against the side of the altar. Now it's a little bit different. Now the high priest presents the animal, lays hands on the animal, slaughters the animal, and where he would splatter it on the altar, Now it takes a bit of a turn, and he goes into the tabernacle with his bowl of bull blood. And it says the high priest will take some of the blood into the tabernacle. He will dip his finger into the blood and sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the inner curtain of the sanctuary. Now, in the tabernacle, you would have this second altar called the altar of incense. That would be further back in the tent. It's sort of this rectangular tent that's divided roughly into thirds, with 2/3 on this side, and then there would be a curtain, and then a third on the other side. And the incense altar would be right in front of the curtain, and on the other side is the Ark of the Covenant from Indiana Jones. And in the Ark of the Covenant, or there above the Ark of the Covenant, is the very presence of God. What the Jews call the Shekinah glory of God is hovering there on the other side of this curtain. And so the high priest brings the blood of this bull into the tabernacle, and he sprinkles it 7 times before the Lord. Before the inner curtain, perhaps even onto the curtain. But he sprinkles the blood, and then the priest will then put some of the blood on the horns of the altar for incense that stands in the Lord's presence inside the tabernacle. And then he takes the rest of the blood, to be very careful here, he takes the rest of the blood and he would pour it out at the base of the altar. It doesn't go on the side of the altar, it comes out on the base of the altar. And then the priest must remove, the next slide, the priest must remove all the fat of the bull to be offered as a sin offering. Now we've seen a priest remove the fat of an animal before. We saw this with the peace offering. When someone would come to bring a peace offering, you would slaughter your animal, you'd remove the fat goes on the altar, and the meat, what happens with it? Anybody remember? You keep it, you eat it, it's yours. So it's starting to look kind of similar in that you remove the fat from the animal, the fat goes on the altar, but then what happens? This includes the fat around the internal organs, the 2 kidneys, and the fat around them near the loins, and the long lobe of the liver. He must remove these along with the kidneys, just as he does with the cattle offered as a peace offering. And he will burn them on the altar of burnt offerings. But he must take whatever is left of the bull, its hide, meat, head, legs, internal organs, and dung, and he doesn't have a meal with it. He carries it away to a place outside the camp that is ceremonially clean, the place where the ashes are dumped, and there on the ash heap, he will burn it on a wood fire. And it is incinerated. So the sin offering, if a high priest sins unintentionally, however that happens, if he accidentally falls down in front of a wagon full of idols, then he is to present a bull, and it can only be a bull. He doesn't have a tapered system of, well, if he can't afford a bull, then he can only bring a bull. He lays hands on it, he slaughters it, and the blood goes here, and then the rest goes at the base of the altar outside. The fat goes on the altar, and the rest of the animal you take outside the camp and you obliterate it. You burn it, and it's a total waste. So a couple of things that come out of this that I want to draw your attention to. First of all, the sacrifice is destroyed. There is no benefit out of this, except we find out in chapter 7 that's, no, never mind, that's later. There is no benefit for anyone. God gets the fat, but then the meat, there's no party. There's just burning it. There's just total loss, because sin is a total loss. And then the other thing is, if the high priest sins, we read back in verse 3, if the high priest sins, bringing guilt upon the entire community, he has to give a sin offering. When the high priest sins unintentionally, it doesn't just bring guilt on himself, but the community becomes guilty. The whole community is stained by his sin. Well, now, wait a minute. I thought I was only guilty for my sin. If I'm one of the common people and he sins, why am I responsible? Right? That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't jive with everything that my upbringing has told me. And yet here, if the high priest sins, I'm guilty. Now, there are a couple of other ways that this would have been offered, beginning in verse 13. If the entire Israelite community sins by violating one of the Lord's commands, but the people don't realize it, they are still guilty. So now I have to wonder, how often did this happen? You're talking about a community of roughly 2 million people at the time Leviticus first arrived. So if the whole 2 million people sin unintentionally, and then they realize it, I mean, if the whole state of Colorado sins and doesn't know it, then when they realize their sin, they need to do this. How often would everybody have sinned together and not known it? Okay, so again, I'm starting to wonder, how often would you really have needed the sin offering? Why bother taking up a whole chapter and a half talking about this offering? Because I don't know how often you would need it. But if the whole community sins, they don't realize that they're still guilty. Verse 14, when they become aware of their sin, the people must bring a young bull as an offering for their sin and present it before the tabernacle. This is the same kind of animal that the high priest would have brought. The elders of the community must then lay their hands on the bull's head and slaughter it before the Lord. When you read the word elder, you might start to get sort of a church idea of elder. But when I think elder in the tribe or in the community of Israel, I think a better picture might be the Native American chief of the tribe, the one who is sort of in charge. He's the patriarch of the village. Okay, that's the idea of the elder that would come forward as sort of a representative for everybody, because you don't have time to parade 2 million people by to everybody lay a hand for just a second. Even if everyone did it for just a second, that's 2 million seconds. That's what, 6 months, 3 months, somewhere in there? That's a long time that it would take for everyone to lay hands. So you probably don't have everybody. You would have the elders that come by and lay hands as a representative. Verse 16, the high priest will then take some of the bull's blood into the tabernacle, dip his finger in the blood, and sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the inner curtain, the same way that he did when it was his offering. He will then put some of the blood on the horns of the altar for fragrant incense that stands in the Lord's presence inside the tabernacle. He will pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar for burnt offerings and at the entrance of the tabernacle, or the altar at the entrance of the tabernacle. Then the priest must remove all the animal's fat and burn it on the altar, just as he does with the bull of the sin offering for the high priest. At this point, everything else is the same. The animal gets presented. The animal has hands laid on it. It is slaughtered. The blood is also taken into the tabernacle, sprinkled before God, put onto this altar, and then poured out. You burn the fat. The rest of the animal is taken away, and it's burned. Verse 22, which we may have to go forward a little bit on the slides. If one of Israel's leaders sins by violating one of the commands of the Lord his God, but doesn't realize it, he's still guilty. So we advance now to the leader. We've looked at what happens with the high priest, and then we look at what happens with the whole community, which is exactly the same, except for how many people lay hands on it. And then if one of the leaders of Israel sins, and he doesn't know it, he's still guilty. So when we talk about a leader, we're talking about one of those elders. We're talking about a prophet, a king, a judge in the book of Judges. Okay, if a leader sins unintentionally, then this is the sacrifice he's supposed to bring. Verse 23, when he becomes aware of his sin, he must bring as his offering a male goat with no defects. We've taken a step down. We're not talking about a bull anymore. Now it's a male goat. It's a less valuable offering, a less expensive offering. Verse 24, he must lay his hand on the goat's head and slaughter it at the place where burnt offerings are slaughtered before the Lord. This is an offering for his sin. Then the priest will dip his finger in the blood of the sin offering and put it on the horns of the altar for burnt offerings. So instead of taking the blood into the tabernacle and putting it on these horns, the blood never goes into the tabernacle if it's just a leader. Instead, it's just put on these horns, on the altar outside. Every time I do this, my hand gets disgusting. All right, where were we? Halfway through verse 25, he will pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. Then he must burn all the goat's fat on the altar, just as he does with the peace offering. Through this process, the priest will purify the leader from his sin, making him right with the Lord, and he will be forgiven. So a couple of big differences between the sacrifice that the leader brings and the sacrifice that the high priest brings. The blood doesn't go into the tabernacle, into the very presence of God. And the blood doesn't go on these horns, it stays outside. Second big difference, the animal is less valuable. The penalty for a leader sinning is not the same as the penalty for a high priest sinning, which is weird. And we'll come back to that. Verse 27, if any of the common people sin by violating one of the Lord's commands, but they don't realize it, they're still guilty. So if someone like one of us sins and we don't realize it, guess what? We're still guilty. When they become aware of their sin, they must bring as an offering for their sin a female goat with no defects. A female goat, which would have been less valuable than a male goat. So now we've stepped down again in value. They must lay a hand on the head of the sin offering and slaughter it at the place where burnt offerings are slaughtered. Presenting, lay hands, slaughter. Then the priest will dip his finger in the blood and put it on the horns of the altar for burnt offerings, just the same way he did with the leader. He will pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. Then he must remove all the goat's fat, just as he does with the fat of the peace offering. He will burn the fat on the altar, and it will be a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Through this process, the priest will purify the people, making them right with the Lord, and they will be forgiven. So through this sacrifice, the people are purified of their sin that they didn't mean to commit, they didn't know they had committed, they had unintentionally done this. They are purified even of these sins through this process. Verse 32, if the people bring a sheep as their sin offering. Well, why would you bring a sheep? A sheep is less valuable yet than a female goat. If you bring a sheep as a sin offering, it must be a female with no defects. They must lay a hand on the head, slaughter it at the place, and everything is the same from there on out. So, as we bring this sin offering, a few things for us to remember. The thing that makes this, the defining feature of the sin offering, is that it's there for unintentional sin. Unintentional sin. Also, we see this sort of graded system that if you're the high priest and you do this, you offer this sacrifice. If you're the community and you sin, you offer this sacrifice. If you're a leader, you offer this one. If you're a commoner, you offer this one. If you can't afford that, you offer this one. If you can't afford that, you offer this one. And later on in chapter 5, it says, if you can't afford the sheep, bring a couple of doves. If you can't afford the doves, bring a handful of flour. So there's this huge slant of how valuable the sacrifice would have been. But it's not based on economics. In previous chapters, the sacrifice, the value of the animal you bring, is based on your wealth. Here it's not based on wealth. Here it's based on influence. It's based on leadership. The high priest is the religious president of the community. Everybody looks to the high priest as the determination of what is clean and what is unclean, what is holy and what's not holy. He is supposed to be the focal point of all things holy. And so if he sins, it brings guilt on everybody. And if the whole community sins, it's the same as if the high priest had sinned. If it's just a political leader, like a king or a judge or perhaps a prophet, then it's still a big deal because you've led these people astray that are beneath you, but it's not as big a deal perhaps as when the high priest sins. And so we have this sort of graded system. Now I come back to this question of how on earth would you sin unintentionally? It doesn't make any sense. Don't you have to know that you're sinning in order for it to be sin? Can you give me some examples? Well, that's what we get in chapter 5. In chapter 5, we begin to see if you do this, that's an unintentional sin. So verse 1, if you are called to testify about something you have seen or that you know about, it is sinful to refuse to testify, and you will be punished for your sin. So we're given this scenario. There's a case going on. There's some kind of trial going on. And the public notice goes out that if you have any information about the whereabouts of this person, if you have any information about what happened that night, then please come forward. And my translation says if you refuse to come forward, then that's one of these sins. I don't much like that translation of the word refuse, because that's kind of intentional. It sounds really intentional. Other translations say if you neglect, perhaps if you forget. Oh, was that today? Oh man, I totally forgot. I really need to go make this right. Okay, so perhaps forgetfulness is what causes an unintentional sin in this case. That I simply wasn't aware. I had a lapse of memory. Verse 2, or suppose you unknowingly touch something that is unclean, such as the carcass of an unclean animal. When you realize what you've done, you must admit your defilement and your guilt. This is true whether it's a wild animal, a domestic animal, or an animal that scurries along the ground. So if perhaps you are starting to cut up meat that you're going to cook over a fire, and you realize, oh wait, this is the wrong kind of animal. This is an unclean animal. Check chapter 11, which we'll get to in 2 weeks. If you realize this is the wrong kind of animal and you've become unclean, then you have to come offer the sacrifice. Or also in verse 3, suppose you unknowingly touch something that makes a person unclean. When you realize what you've done, you must admit your guilt. Other things that would make you unclean. A grave that isn't clearly marked. So if you walk over a grave that doesn't have a good enough marker and you didn't realize it was there, but then you think, oh man, this is a grave. You're unclean because you've come into contact with the dead. Let's see, what are some other ones? Food, grave. If you find moss in your house, if you touch moss or mildew, if you have something that gives you a rash, if you have some kind of contact with something that makes you unclean, then you have to come offer this sacrifice. Which raises the question, how is that a matter of guilt? If I eat pork, do I really need to come and offer a sin offering? Because is that really sin? Is it really sin to touch mildew? Is it sin to find yourself standing on a grave? Doesn't that just make you unclean? Well, when we ask that kind of question, we assume that the Hebrews made some kind of distinction between uncleanness and sin. And they didn't. There is no distinction for them between ritual uncleanness and what we might call moral uncleanness. Unclean is unclean. To touch mildew, to touch pork, is the same as to have an affair. They are both something that separates you from God in the Hebrew mindset. And so when I realize that I've done this, then I have to come offer a sin offering. Some commentators have suggested that maybe this should be called the purification offering rather than a sin offering, to purify me either from ritual uncleanness or from moral uncleanness. It's just to cleanse me of things that I didn't realize I had done. And then one more example in verse 4. Suppose you make a foolish vow of any kind, whether its purpose is for good or for bad. When you realize its foolishness, you must admit your guilt. You make this vow that I'm going to do something, or I'm going to give this something to God. I'm going to be perhaps a Nazirite, and then I realize that my dad is a winemaker. There's no way I'm going to be able to survive a Nazirite vow being constantly surrounded by grapes. So perhaps you make this vow and you realize this is very foolish, that I just made a dumb decision. That would be an unintentional sin, sort of a lapse in judgment. It's not high-handed against God. It's that's really not going to work. That was a pretty bad idea, wasn't it? Okay, so a lapse in judgment would call for an unintentional sin. So what do you do when you realize that you've committed this unintentional sin? Verse 5, when you become aware of your guilt in any of these ways, you must confess your sin. Then you must bring to the Lord as a penalty for your sin a female from the flock, either a sheep or a goat. the sin offering with which the priest will purify you, making you right with the Lord. So there was a court case, and I forgot to testify. I touched something that was unclean. I found myself standing on a grave. I ended up touching the carcass of a pig because it had died on my land, and I had to move it off the land, and I've touched it. I took a vow that was really kind of dumb, and so now I need to come and offer this sin offering. Well, if you're the high priest, then when you offer the sin offering, you would bring a bull, and the blood goes into the tabernacle. If the whole community does this together, then the blood goes into the tabernacle. If you're a political leader or a prophet, then the blood stays outside and goes on the altar. If you're a normal person, the blood goes outside on the altar, on the horns of the altar. This is the sin offering. This is how you would have been cleansed from these kinds of sins. Now, real quickly, let's go through the fifth kind of sacrifice, which, good grief, we're going to get through 2.5 chapters today, which there's a little silver lining there, that we'll have 2.5 chapters behind us. But skipping down to verse 14, we'll look at the guilt offering, which in the Hebrew language is called the asham. Let me hear you say asham. Okay, that way I know you're still awake. The asham is the guilt offering. Then the Lord said to Moses, "If one of you commits a sin by unintentionally defiling the Lord's sacred property, you must bring a guilt offering to the Lord." So the guilt offering also deals with unintentional sin, but it's unintentional sin in that it also is defiling God's sacred property, be it the altar or the incense altar or the menorah in the tabernacle or the tent of the tabernacle itself or the showbread or any of the things that are sort of in God's sacred treasury. If you've defiled one of them, then you come and bring a guilt offering. Continuing in verse 15, the offering must be your own ram with no defects, or you may buy one of equal value with silver as measured by the weight of the sanctuary shekel. You must make restitution for the sacred property you have harmed by paying for the loss plus an additional 20%. Okay, so there's sort of like a 20% fee on top of the total cost of whatever it is. So if I have in some way defiled the altar, then I am responsible not only for paying for the damage to the altar or what it would cost to build a new one, but I also have to pay 20% on top of that, which wouldn't be a big deal except that it's covered in bronze. And this one is covered in gold. And so if I defile these and I have to pay to replace those and I have to pay 20% on top, I mean, this is the kind of sin that would absolutely lambaste you. I mean, you would be toast for the rest of your life. This kind of debt would be insurmountable. When you give the payment to the priest, he will purify you with the ram sacrificed as a guilt offering, making you right with the Lord, and you will be forgiven. Verse 17, suppose you sin by violating one of the Lord's commands. Even if you're unaware of what you've done, you are guilty and will be punished for your sin. For a guilt offering, you must bring to the priest your own ram with no defects, or you may buy one of equal value. If you want to know exactly how this would have happened, the presenting, laying hands, slaughtering, what happens with the blood, that's in chapter 7, but it's basically the same thing that we've seen all along. But you would bring this to the priest, and through this process, the priest will purify you from your unintentional sin, making you right with the Lord, and you will be forgiven. This is a guilt offering. This is an asham, for you have been guilty of an offense against the Lord. And then I think things begin to get sort of interesting as they can get when you're talking about offerings. Chapter 6. Then the Lord said to Moses, suppose one of you sins against your associate and is unfaithful to the Lord. So suppose you sin against your neighbor and in doing so sin against the Lord. Suppose you cheat in a deal involving a security deposit, or you steal, or you commit fraud, or you find lost property and you lie about it, or you lie while swearing to tell the truth, or you commit any other such sin. If I in some way deceive you, if I in some way rob from you, if I in some way deny you something that you are due, then I am guilty. If you have sinned in any of these ways, you are guilty. You must give back whatever you stole, or the money you took by extortion, or the security deposit, or the lost property you found, or anything obtained by swearing falsely. You must make restitution by paying the full price, plus an additional 20% to the person you have harmed. So, I make a loan to my friend, and he gives me some kind of collateral for this loan. And then when he repays me, I hold on to the collateral, and I say that I lost it, or I say that it was destroyed, and I in some way have robbed him. Then I have to do two things. First, I have to come and offer the guilt offering. I have to bring a ram, which there is no graded system for if you're richer or poorer, or if you have more influence or less influence. Anybody who does this brings a ram. And the second thing I have to do is pay my friend the security deposit that he gave me that I stole from him, and I have to pay him 20% on top of that. So I have to make restitution with him, because this sin isn't just between us. It isn't just between me and God, it's also between us. I've sinned against him. Continuing in verse 5, on the same day you present a guilt offering. On the same day you must present a guilt offering. As a guilt offering to the Lord, you must bring to the priest your own ram with no defects, or you may buy one of equal value. And through this process, the priest will purify you before the Lord, making you right with him, and you will be forgiven for any of these sins you have committed. The guilt offering has to do with my relationship with other people. It has to do with something where restitution can be made. If I can in some way repay what I've done, then I do a guilt offering. If there's no way to repay it, for example, if I accidentally had an affair, which I don't know how that happens, but if I unintentionally broke a command that really there's no way that you repay that, it's just the damage is just done, you bring a sin offering. But if you can repay it, you bring a guilt offering, because the guilt offering is paid with this sort of repayment. Now, by way of reflection, just a couple of thoughts. We give you 3 thoughts that I have looking over these chapters. First of all, God recognizes some sins are more costly than others. This is not the same as saying that different sins are different to God. This is really hard to articulate. I've been told all my life that one sin is not different from another. A gossip is just as guilty as a murderer, and a murderer is just as guilty as a rapist, and a rapist is just as guilty as any other kind of sinner. And that's true. All sin separates us from God. But at the same time, God also recognizes that some sin has more of an effect than others. If the high priest sins, it's a bigger deal than if one of the common people sins, because he's a leader, and people are looking to him as an example of holiness. And so the penalty for his sin is greater. Why is it that the high priest has to bring a bull, where a leader only has to bring a goat, and a commoner only has to bring a sheep, or a dove, or flour? Why is it that James would tell us, our brother James, several hundred years later, would say in chapter 3, not many of you should become teachers in the church, for we who teach will be judged more strictly. Those who are in a position of spiritual leadership have a greater responsibility, and they receive stricter judgment because they do have influence. If a common person sort of leaves the path and they go astray, then they've gone astray. But if the high priest goes astray, everybody follows him, and so there's more cost to his sin. That's why you call for a greater sacrifice. One of the things that I think makes this really hard for us to understand is that we always think about sin in terms of between me and God. That if I sin, this is just an offense between me and God. But that's not true. Oftentimes, sin is not just me and God, but it's me and other people. That I have in some way offended or sinned against someone else. For example, Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son. We talked about this a little bit last week in Luke 15. The son goes away and squanders his father's money. And then he comes back and he says this to his father: "Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you. I have sinned against you." Well, wait a minute. Sin is just between me and God. No, sin is between him and his father as well. Or during the 10 plagues, after the 8th plague, which is the plague of locust, I believe, Pharaoh calls Moses in, and Pharaoh speaks with Moses, and he says, "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you." Pharaoh doesn't just say, "Yeah, I've sinned against your God." He says, "Moses, I've sinned against you." This is between us as well, personally. Another example comes to us out of 1 Samuel. Jonathan, who's the son of King David, is sticking up for his friend David. He's the son of Saul sticking up for his friend David. The king must not sin against his servant David, he tells his father. You must not sin against this other person. Why? Because sin is between other people. One more example comes out of one of the letters of Paul. Paul says, "Run from sexual sin. No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does. For sexual immorality is a sin against your own body." Well, now, wait a minute. No. I thought sexual sin was just something between me and God. I thought that was just like I've become somehow impure, and so God and I need to reconcile this. But actually, he says, when you commit sexual sin, it's a sin against yourself. And some kind of internal reconciliation needs to happen. Interesting. So one of the reasons that I think it's so hard for us to see that God sees one sin as more costly than another is because we think it's just between us. But it's not just between us. Sin often is between me and someone else. And so the more people that I've offended, the more cost there is to it. And the more reparation needs to be done. Second thing that I want to share with you is that guilt is a matter of action. It's not a matter of knowledge. It's not a matter of intention. It's a matter of what you've done. Ignorance is not an excuse. We see this over and over in these 2.5 chapters. If you sin and you don't realize it, then when you become aware, you're guilty. Well, wait a minute. I thought you couldn't sin if you weren't aware. Like, what about all these people that don't know God's law? If I didn't know God's law, how can I sin? It's like if you're driving down the road and your speedometer is broken and you get pulled over, bloop, bloop, and police pull you to the side, and they say, "Do you know how fast you were going?" And you say, "Yeah, my speedometer says 35. And he says, "Well, my radar says 55. Radar says 55. You're going 20 over. "Oh, I didn't know." That doesn't matter, because it's not a matter of what you were intending to do. It's not a matter of what you did or did not know. It's a matter of simply you went too fast. You broke the law. Right? And so he might have sympathy for you. He might, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Here's your ticket." Because it's not a matter of what I meant to do or didn't mean to do. It's a matter of what actually happened. It's a matter of what transpired. Whether or not I knew the law, whether or not I knew what I was doing was wrong, it's wrong whether I know it is or not. Third thing that I want to share with you as we wrap up. The proper response to sin is you confess, you sacrifice, and you make reparation. In the very beginning of chapter 6, we saw that when you realize that you've sinned against your friend by withholding a security deposit or stealing or however you do this sin against another person, you need to confess your sin. And I would advise you, if you like to take notes in your Bible, highlight the word confess, underline it, because that's a really important part of the guilt offering, that you would say, "I have done this." And confession isn't just saying, "I am a sinner." Often, we sort of chop confession down as it's just, I belong to this big group of people that we call sinners. I am one of them, and so I need to leave this group and become a part of this other group. But that's not what confession is about. Confession is about saying, "I did this. Yesterday, 2:30, nobody was in the house, and I did this." That's confession. Recognizing an act, a specific, tangible, quantifiable act. And then after I've confessed, then I would come and I would offer some kind of sacrifice. Depending on whether I knew this sin or not, sin is always accompanied with sacrifice, whether it's a burnt offering, a peace offering, a guilt offering, a sin offering, a grain offering. It's always accompanied by sacrifice, which of course we have our eternal sacrifice in Christ. And then finally, reparation. I have to make some kind of amends. When there's an opportunity for me to go and repay what's happened, I need to go and repay it. Okay, so I've committed this sin against my friend, and I messed him over for about $300. And he's short because of what I did. Part of dealing with sin is that you go and repay it. And yes, Jesus' sacrifice is enough to cover it. But at the same time, go and repay. You don't just use the sacrifice as a way of saying, it's behind me and I don't have to deal with it anymore. If there's some kind of lingering effect, especially between you and someone else, you make it right. Because this is what it's all about for the church, to make things right. We're in the business of rectifying injustice. And so in the guilt offering, you would rectify injustice by repaying for damages. Some of you are here today, and you have reparations that need to be made. And maybe it's some kind of monetary thing that, I really need to just repay this person, and I'm not so sure about the 20% fee, but perhaps it's service. Perhaps it's honesty. Perhaps it's coming clean with someone about something that you've been holding back. Reparation, making things right. Some of you are here today, and that's where you are. You've confessed, you have the sacrifice, but now it's time to go back and fix what you've done as best you can. May you see that Jesus is an all-sufficient sin sacrifice for us, covering even the sins that we didn't know we were committing while we were still lost. Paul says that Jesus died for us while we were still sinners. Jesus didn't wait until we had realized and come forward and confessed. He died while we were still ignorant. He forgave us while we were still ignorant. So may you realize that he is this all-sufficient sin offering. May you realize that some sin does have more of an effect and more of an influence and more of a cost than others. And may you make reparation wherever you can.